Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases in Appalachian history. Today we'll delve into the events that shook the Virginia mountains in 1921, a time when the silence of the forests held secrets that should never have come to light. If you're following along, please let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Let's get started. The Virginia Appalachians have always held a unique atmosphere. Mountains shrouded in dense fog, deep valleys barely penetrated by sunlight, and isolated communities that lived almost like islands lost in time. It was the autumn of 1921, and the Wise County region was entering the coldest months. Poorly maintained dirt roads made any journey a perilous adventure, especially when the rains turned the paths into rivers of mud. The families who inhabited these mountainous lands depended on hunting, small-scale farming, and coal mining to survive. Life was harsh, and the law often arrived too late, if at all. Marybelle Carter was known throughout the region as a woman of striking presence. By the age of 32, she had built a controversial reputation in the communities surrounding Norton, a small town nestled among the mountains. Marybelle didn't fit the standards expected of women of that era. She traveled alone, traded land, frequented taverns, and engaged in direct conversation with men, something that made even the most conservative among them uncomfortable. Her dark hair, always tied in a tight bun, her piercing eyes, and her firm stride made her an impossible figure to ignore. She lived in a secluded property on the county's highest slopes, a wooden cabin surrounded by ancient trees that created a natural barrier against prying eyes. Few ever visited. Those who dared climb there told strange stories about lights flickering in the windows in the early morning hours, voices echoing through the valley on windless nights, and an uneasy feeling that gripped anyone who got too close. Marybelle rarely received visitors, but when she went down to town to buy supplies or negotiate a deal, her presence always generated whispers. The first sign that something was amiss came in mid-October. A farmer named Thomas Belmont, who lived a few miles from Marybelle's property, reported to the local sheriff that he had seen strange activity in the area. He said that, as he walked along the trail leading to her cabin, he noticed fresh horse and wagon tracks, unusual for someone who lived such a secluded life. Thomas also mentioned a strong, unpleasant odor coming from the direction of the property, an odor he couldn't identify but which made him feel nauseous. The sheriff, a man named Harold Pritchard, listened to the report with skepticism. Marybelle had always been the target of gossip and unfounded accusations, and he saw no reason to investigate based solely on rumors. But the reports continued. A week later, a woman named Estelle Monroe showed up at the sheriff's office with a disturbing story. She said her brother, a traveling merchant named Leonard Monroe, had come up to Marybelle's property 3 weeks earlier to offer her goods and never returned. Leonard usually sent letters to the family every 10 days, but the silence had gone on for too long. Estelle was desperate and begged for someone to investigate. Sheriff Pritchard, still reluctant, promised to make inquiries but took no immediate action. It wasn't until a third report reached the authorities that the situation took on a more serious tone. A group of hunters exploring the more remote areas of the mountains found abandoned personal belongings in a clearing near Marybelle's property. Among the objects were a leather backpack, some cooking utensils, and documents identifying the owner as Leonard Monroe. The hunters took the items to town and turned them over to the sheriff. This time, Harold Pritchard could no longer ignore it. He gathered 2 deputies and decided it was time to climb to Marybelle Carter's cabin and find out what was really going on in those dark mountains. The climb was difficult. The path was steep and covered in damp leaves, making every step treacherous. The morning mist hadn't yet completely dissipated, and the feeling of being watched accompanied the group every meter they walked. When they finally reached the property, it was completely silent. No animal sounds, no movement in the trees, only the cold wind blowing through the bare branches. The cabin seemed abandoned at first glance, with the windows closed and the door locked. The sheriff knocked several times, announcing his presence, but no one answered. After waiting for a few minutes, he decided to force his way in. What they found inside that cabin would forever mark the memories of everyone present. The sense that something terrible had happened there was palpable, and the first clues were only the beginning of a discovery that would turn out to be far darker than anyone could have imagined. The cabin's interior was shrouded in darkness. Heavy curtains blocked most of the outside light, and the air carried a musty odor mixed with something indefinable that made the men cover their noses with handkerchiefs. Sheriff Pritchard lit a lantern and began to examine the room. The first impression was of recent abandonment. Dirty dishes were piled in the sink, clothes were strewn over a wooden chair, and the fireplace held warm ashes, indicating someone had been there for the past few hours. The main room was modest, with simple, weather-beaten furniture. A table in the center displayed scattered papers, some of which appeared to be records of business transactions, others merely incomprehensible notes. The sheriff picked up some of these documents and examined them by the light of the lantern. There were names of people he recognized, local residents, dates dating back to the last few months, and amounts that suggested some kind of business. But none of this explained Leonard Monroe's disappearance or the strange stories circulating about the place. One of the deputies drew the sheriff's attention to a door at the back of the cabin. It was ajar and led to a cellar. Pritchard felt a tightness in his chest. Cellars in isolated mountain homes were common for storing food during the winter, but something about this particular door emanated a sense of danger. He descended the wooden steps, which creaked under his weight, holding the lantern in front of him. The smell intensified as he descended, and when he finally reached the packed dirt floor, the sight froze him. The basement was larger than expected, a sort of subterranean chamber carved into the mountain rock. Makeshift shelves lined the walls, but they didn't contain the expected food or tools. Instead, there were glass jars containing dark liquids, wooden boxes fastened shut with rusty nails, and personal items that clearly belonged to different people. Shoes of various sizes, hats, bags, pocket watches, rings. It was as if someone were collecting travelers' belongings. Pritchard called his deputies, and together they began mentally cataloguing what they saw. Among the objects, they found a wallet containing identification documents belonging to Leonard Monroe. The discovery confirmed their darkest suspicions. But Leonard wasn't the only one. There were belongings that appeared to have belonged to at least 5 or 6 other people. The sheriff recognized some of the names on documents found there. They were itinerant traders, travelers who had passed through the area in recent years, and according to old reports had never been seen again. One of the assistants found a diary hidden under a pile of old fabrics. The yellowed pages contained notes in elegant cursive, clearly written by Marybelle. The earliest entries dated 1918, 3 years earlier. She described her life in the mountains, her financial hardships, and her growing bitterness toward the locals who shunned and judged her. As the pages turned, the tone changed. She began to write about opportunities, about people passing through the area who would be missed, about the need to survive at any cost. The most recent entries were disturbing. Marybelle described encounters with travelers, seemingly cordial conversations that ended abruptly. She mentioned a man who had sold fabrics and ended up staying for dinner, another who offered tools and decided to spend the night in the cabin due to bad weather, a third who negotiated the purchase of land and was never seen again descending the mountain. The details were vague, but the implication was clear. Marybelle had found a way to solve her financial problems, and that way involved making people disappear. The sheriff felt a chill run down his spine as he realized the magnitude of what they were uncovering. This wasn't just an isolated incident. That isolated cabin in the mountains had become the scene of a series of events the community never imagined could happen so close to their homes. Pritchard ordered his deputies to collect every document and object that could serve as evidence. They needed to find Marybelle Carter as soon as possible and bring her to account. While working, one of the assistants noticed marks on the basement's dirt floor. They were deep grooves, as if something heavy had been dragged repeatedly toward a specific wall. Upon closer inspection, they discovered that part of the rock wall had been removed and replaced, creating a sort of hidden compartment. Using improvised tools, they managed to dislodge the stones. What they found behind them made even the most experienced men's stomachs churn. There in that secret chamber, carved into the very rock of the mountain, lay the traces of what Marybelle had hidden for years. There was no denying it anymore. The evidence was irrefutable and terrifying. Sheriff Pritchard knew this case would forever change the history of Wise County, and that the secrets of this lonely woman in the mountains would finally come to light in a way no one could have predicted. The news spread through the Virginia mountains like wildfire. Within hours, the entire Wise County region knew that something terrible had been discovered on Marybelle Carter's property. Rumors grew with each rebroadcast, and people gathered in taverns, churches, and town squares to discuss what had really happened in that isolated cabin. Sheriff Pritchard, aware of the gravity of the situation, sent messengers to neighboring counties requesting support in the search for Marybelle, who had disappeared without a trace. As the hunt intensified, a team of investigators began documenting everything found on the property. Every personal item was catalogued, every paper examined, every detail recorded. The work was slow and meticulous, but necessary. Among the belongings found were unsent letters, written by people clearly hoping to return to their families. One, written by a man named William Hodges, mentioned that he had struck a good deal with a woman in the mountains and would soon be back home with enough money to buy seeds for the next harvest. The letter never reached its destination. Local newspapers began publishing stories about the case. The Norton Gazette, the region's leading newspaper, ran a front-page headline that shocked even the most skeptical. "Disturbing discoveries in Wise Mountains reveal dark secrets." The article cautiously described what had been found, avoiding graphic details, but making it clear that the situation was serious. The paper mentioned that at least 6 people had been identified through belongings found on the property, all of whom were travelers who had passed through the area between 1918 and 1921. The community was divided. Some believed Marybelle was a cold, calculating killer who had tricked innocent travelers into stealing their belongings. Others, however, remembered the hardships she had faced over the years. Marybelle had lost her husband in a coal mining accident in 1916, leaving her alone to care for the property without resources or support. Society at the time didn't offer many options for a widowed woman in the mountains. Some argued that loneliness and despair might have corrupted her morals, turning her into something she never imagined she would become. Meanwhile, the search for Marybelle expanded. Groups of armed men scoured the region's known trails, valleys, and caves. The rugged Appalachian topography offered countless hiding places, and finding a single person in that vast expanse was like searching for a needle in a haystack. Temperatures were beginning to drop as late October approached, and concerns grew that Marybelle might not survive long in the mountain cold, especially if she were injured or without adequate supplies. On the 5th day of the search, a rancher named Elijah Booker showed up at the sheriff's office with crucial information. He said that 2 days before the cabin discovery, he had seen a woman matching Marybelle's description walking south, following an old hunter's trail that led to the Lee County line. Elijah said she was carrying a large backpack and appeared to be in a hurry, avoiding eye contact when he tried to greet her. At the time, he hadn't thought much of the encounter, but now he realized the information could be crucial. Sheriff Pritchard immediately organized a new expedition focused on the southern part of the county. The trail Elijah mentioned was known to be dangerous, full of ravines and areas where the ground could give way without warning. It was also a little-traveled route, making it an ideal path for someone looking to disappear. The team set out at dawn, armed and prepared to face the hostile terrain. As the search continued, more details about Marybelle's life began to emerge. Neighbors who had previously avoided discussing her now shared memories and observations. A woman named Dorothy Simmons recalled that Marybelle would often visit town after long periods of absence, and that on these occasions she seemed to have enough money to buy supplies in bulk, something inconsistent with the precarious financial situation everyone knew. Another resident, a merchant named Albert Rains, mentioned that Marybelle had tried to sell him some valuables over the years, including pocket watches and rings that he now suspected belonged to the victims. Marybelle Carter's story was being pieced together, and what emerged was a portrait of a woman who had crossed a line that should never have been crossed. But many questions remained unanswered. How exactly did she convince travelers to stay on her property? What happened on those nights in the mountains? And most importantly, where was she now? The tension in the area was palpable. Families locked their doors early. Travelers avoided the isolated areas, and the fear that Marybelle might be watching from somewhere hidden kept everyone on high alert. The case had become something bigger than a simple criminal investigation. It had become a symbol of all that could go wrong when isolation, despair, and a lack of compassion meet in the shadows of the Appalachian Mountains. The expedition, heading south into Wise County, faced increasingly difficult conditions. The trail Elijah Booker had mentioned narrowed as it advanced into the hillsides, becoming little more than a wildlife path. The trees formed a canopy so dense that sunlight barely penetrated, creating an atmosphere of permanent twilight even in the middle of the day. The group had to advance slowly, testing each step to avoid slipping or falling into the canyons that opened without warning alongside the path. On the 3rd day of searching in that direction, they found the first concrete sign. A small unlit campfire, still lingering with fresh ashes, indicated someone had recently camped there. Around the site were footprints that appeared to belong to a single person, and the size of the marks matched what would be expected of a woman. Sheriff Pritchard felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They were on the right track, but it also meant Marybelle was moving faster than they had anticipated, even carrying supplies and crossing hostile terrain. Following the footprints, the group arrived at an area known locally as Raven's Gorge, a deep gorge cut by a stream flowing down from the highest mountains. The place had a dark reputation among the locals. Travelers were said to have disappeared there, lost in the dense fog that appeared out of nowhere or falling fatally from the cliffs. It was also a place where the natural acoustics created strange echoes, causing voices and sounds to multiply in disconcerting ways. It was there, on the bank of the creek, that they found more evidence. A woolen blanket hung from a low branch, clearly left to dry. Nearby, marks on the ground indicated someone had rested against a rock. The sheriff ordered the group to split up to cover more ground, but to maintain visual contact with each other. The last thing they needed was for anyone to get lost in that natural maze of rocks and trees. One of the men, an experienced tracker named Jesse Tate, noticed something the others had missed. Scratch marks on a nearby rock suggested someone had climbed toward a higher rock formation. Jesse followed the trail, and after a few minutes of careful climbing, found the entrance to a small cave hidden by vegetation. He called the others, and together they cautiously approached. The cave was shallow, no more than 5 or 6 meters deep, but it offered protection from the wind and rain. Inside they found more signs of recent occupation. There were scraps of food, a half-empty water bottle, and a torn piece of cloth that appeared to have been used as a bandage. But Marybelle was not there. She had left again, probably realizing she was being followed. What caught the sheriff's attention most was a small notebook abandoned deep in the cave, partially hidden under loose rocks. Opening it, he immediately recognized the same elegant handwriting as the diary found in the cabin. They were recent entries, clearly made during the escape. Marybelle wrote about the regret that consumed her, about the sleepless nights when the faces of those who had trusted her came back to haunt her. She mentioned that she had started it all just wanting to survive, that the first time had been an accident, an argument that ended badly, and that after that, every next step seemed inevitable. The words in the notebook revealed a tormented mind. Marybelle wrote that she knew there was no going back, that the life she had known had ended the moment she crossed that line. She mentioned that she had considered turning herself in, but fear of public judgment, humiliation, and the gallows kept her going. There were also passages where she tried to justify her actions, arguing that the travelers were just strangers passing through, that no one would really care about them, that she herself had been forgotten and abandoned by society. The sheriff closed the notebook with a heavy sigh. Those words didn't absolve Marybelle of her actions, but they offered a window into how a person could reach such a point. Extreme loneliness, crushing poverty, the absence of any support network, all of this had created an environment where morale slowly deteriorated until the unthinkable became possible. Still, there were real victims, people with families who deserved justice. The search continued with renewed determination. The notebook entries suggested that Marybelle was injured, possibly with a sprained ankle that made her movement difficult. This explained why she had stopped to rest so often. The group now had the upper hand and knew it was only a matter of time before they caught up with her. As they progressed further south, the terrain began to change. Densely forested mountains gave way to more open areas with exposed rock formations and less vegetation. It was easier territory to traverse, but also harder to hide in. Marybelle would be increasingly exposed, and her escape options diminished with every mile traveled. The sun was beginning to set when they spotted movement in the distance. A lone figure was walking slowly along a rocky ridge, clearly limping. Sheriff Pritchard raised his binoculars and confirmed it. It was Marybelle Carter. After days of tireless searching, they had finally found her. The group positioned themselves strategically, surrounding the area to prevent her from escaping again. The final confrontation was about to happen. Sheriff Pritchard signaled for his men to advance cautiously. The last thing he wanted was to provoke a desperate reaction that could result in further tragedy. Marybelle hadn't yet noticed the group's presence, focused as she was on traversing the uneven terrain with her injured leg. The orange evening light cast long shadows on the rocks, creating an almost unreal setting for that final moment. When they finally got close enough to be heard, the sheriff called her name. Marybelle stopped dead in her tracks, her entire body stiffening as if struck by lightning. She turned slowly, and for the first time the men could see her face up close. It was lined with extreme exhaustion, her sunken eyes betraying sleepless nights, and there was an expression of resignation that spoke volumes. She didn't try to run. She didn't scream. She just stood there, standing on the edge of the rocky ridge, as if she had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Pritchard took a few more steps forward, keeping his hands visible to show he had no intention of violence. He told her she needed to return with them, that there were issues that needed clarification, that families deserved answers. Marybelle listened in silence, her eyes fixed on the distant horizon where the sun touched the mountains. When she finally spoke, her voice was hoarse and weak, but thick with restrained emotion. She said she knew there was no escape, that from the moment she left the cabin she expected capture. Marybelle explained that she had fled, not because she believed she could avoid justice, but because she needed time to process everything she had done, to finally confront the person she had become. She mentioned that during those days in the mountains, alone with her thoughts, she had relived every encounter, every decision, every moment when she could have chosen a different path. The sheriff asked about the travelers, about what had really happened in that cabin over the years. Marybelle closed her eyes for a long moment before answering. She said the first time had been a genuine accident. A merchant named Richard Dawson had come up to her property in 1918 to offer tools. They talked, and he agreed to stay for dinner due to the approaching bad weather. During the evening, an argument arose over payment for some goods Marybelle had previously purchased, but had been unable to pay. The argument escalated. Richard became aggressive, and in the heat of the confrontation, something happened that changed everything. After that first incident, Marybelle panicked. She knew that if the truth were discovered, she would be hanged without hesitation. Society would not forgive a woman in her situation, especially considering her already tarnished reputation. So she hid all the evidence, buried her belongings, and tried to move on as if nothing had happened. But something inside her had snapped. The line between right and wrong, once so clear, now seemed blurred. When another traveler showed up months later, Marybelle saw an opportunity. She desperately needed money, and this man carried enough coins to tide her over the winter. The rationalization was easy. No one would know. No one would miss a passing stranger, and so began a pattern that would repeat itself over the following years. It became easier and easier to justify, easier to silence one's conscience, easier to see these people not as individuals with lives and families, but as solutions to their problems. Marybelle spoke of the loneliness that consumed her in that isolated cabin. She described how the nights became endless, how the silence of the mountains began to weigh down on her like a giant rock. There was no one to talk to, no one who cared if she was alive or dead. Bitterness grew inside her like a weed, poisoning every thought, every feeling. She began to blame the world for her situation, to see everyone else as enemies who had abandoned her. The sheriff listened in silence, his grave expression revealing the weight of those confessions. The other men remained quiet, some visibly disturbed by Marybelle's words. She continued speaking, as if needing to release everything she had held in for so long. He mentioned the times he had almost given himself up, the times he had gone down to town intending to confess everything to the sheriff, but always backed out at the last minute, unable to face the consequences. When she finished speaking, Marybelle felt smaller, as if the weight of the words had hollowed her out. She held out her wrists toward the sheriff, a gesture of complete surrender. Pritchard slowly approached and slipped on the iron handcuffs, locking them with a metallic click that echoed through the silent valley. The group began the return journey, walking slowly to accommodate Marybelle's injured leg. The descent from the mountains took 2 full days. Throughout the journey, Marybelle remained silent, lost in her own thoughts. When they finally reached Norton, a crowd was already waiting in the streets. News of her capture had reached them before them, and hundreds of people gathered to see the woman who had caused so much horror. Some shouted insults, others simply watched in shocked silence. The sheriff had to fight his way through the crowd to take her to the county jail. Marybelle was placed in an isolated cell where she would remain until her trial. The cold stone walls and the small barred window were now her only world. She sat on the narrow bunk and looked at her hands, hands that had worked the land, cooked meals and committed acts that now haunted her. The silence of the cell was different from the silence of the mountains. This was a silence of finitude, of doors closing, of a future that no longer existed. The days following Marybelle Carter's capture were marked by unprecedented unrest in Wise County. The small town of Norton, which normally lived a quiet and predictable rhythm, became a regional center of attention. Journalists from neighboring counties began arriving, notebooks in hand, eager for details about the case that was already being called the Appalachian Horror. The Norton Gazette published extra editions daily, and copies sold out within hours. People wanted to understand how this had happened right under their noses, how someone living among them, albeit in isolation, could have kept such dark secrets for so long. Sheriff Pritchard organized a team dedicated solely to investigating every aspect of Marybelle's life and trying to identify all possible victims. The task was monumental. Records at the time were poor, especially in rural and mountainous areas where many people lived without proper documentation. Traveling merchants in particular were difficult to track. Many had no fixed residence, constantly moving from town to town, county to county, depending on business opportunities. Their families, if any, often lost contact for long periods without considering it unusual. The team began working with the objects found in the cabin, trying to connect each item to a specific person. The silver pocket watch engraved with the initials WH was identified as belonging to William Hodges, a Kentucky draper who had disappeared in 1919. The family, contacted by telegraph, confirmed that William had mentioned in his last letter that he planned to cross the Virginia mountains before returning home. That letter, found among Marybelle's belongings, had never been sent. A simple wedding ring with an inscription inside that read, "To Leonard with eternal love," was recognized by Leonard Monroe's sister. She traveled to Norton to see the ring in person, and as she held it in her trembling hands, burst into tears. She told investigators that Leonard was a kind man who helped anyone in need, and that he had likely offered assistance to Marybelle without realizing the danger he was putting himself in. Leonard's wife, unknowingly widowed, now had to deal with the terrible truth about her husband's fate. Each object had a story. Each identification brought more pain to families who had spent years not knowing the fate of their loved ones. A Tennessee blacksmith recognized a pair of fine leather boots as the kind he had made for his cousin, a hunter who had disappeared during an expedition through the region in 1920. A Bible with a name inscribed on the cover had belonged to an itinerant preacher who traveled the Appalachians, offering sermons in isolated communities. His congregation in West Virginia had prayed for his safe return for months, never imagining he would ever return. As the investigation continued, the county prosecutor, a stern man named Theodore Blackwood, began preparing the case for trial. Blackwood was known for his uncompromising stance on crime and had publicly stated that he would seek the maximum sentence for Marybelle. He saw the case not only as a matter of individual justice, but as an opportunity to send a clear message about the rule of law, even in the most remote and isolated areas. No one, he argued, was above the law, no matter how difficult their personal circumstances. Marybelle's defense was taken over by a local attorney named Samuel Garrett, appointed by the court because she lacked the resources to hire her own representation. Garrett was a middle-aged man known for his compassion and his belief that everyone deserved a fair defense, regardless of the severity of the charges. He visited Marybelle in her cell several times during the weeks leading up to the trial, trying to devise some strategy that might at least save her life from the gallows. During these conversations, Garrett discovered aspects of Marybelle's story that had not been widely known. She told him about her difficult childhood in a poor mining family, how she had lost 3 brothers at a young age to illness and accidents, and how she had married at 16 a man who promised to rescue her from that life of misery. The initially promising marriage deteriorated when her husband began drinking heavily. He died 5 years later in a mining accident, leaving her alone and in debt. Marybelle described the following years as a slow drowning. She tried to find work washing clothes, sewing, and doing whatever chores came her way, but prejudice against single women in the mountain communities made everything more difficult. Some men harassed her, seeing her as vulnerable. Other women avoided her, considering her presence a threat to their marriages. She found herself increasingly isolated, pushed to the margins of society, until she finally moved to that remote cabin where she could at least live without the constant judgmental stares. Garrett knew that this story, tragic as it was, didn't justify Marybelle's actions, but he hoped it might create some understanding of how a person could reach such a point. He planned to argue that extreme loneliness and crushing poverty had impaired his client's judgment, that she wasn't an innate monster, but rather a person broken by impossible circumstances and who had made terrible decisions as a result. Meanwhile, the press continued to fuel public interest. Speculative articles appeared in newspapers across the region, some portraying Marybelle as a calculating demon, others as a victim of society turned tormentor. Dramatic illustrations depicted the lonely mountain cabin, surrounded by ominous fog, or portrayed Marybelle as a shadowy figure stalking unsuspecting travelers. The truth, as always, was more complex than any of these simplistic depictions. The victims' families began arriving in Norton as the trial date approached. They wanted to be present. They wanted to look into the eyes of the woman who had taken their loved ones. They wanted to hear the explanations, if any explanations even existed. The local hotel was packed, and residents opened their homes to accommodate the visitors. The entire town seemed to be in a state of suspense, awaiting the moment when a reckoning would finally be settled. In her cell, Marybelle spent her days in profound silence. She refused most meals, eating only enough to stay alive. Sometimes she wrote on scraps of paper the sheriff provided her whenever she requested. These notes were carefully guarded, for they contained reflections on her life, on the choices she had made, on the regret that now consumed her completely. In one of her entries, she wrote that the worst part was not the fear of death, but having to live with herself knowing what she had done. A local priest, Reverend Marcus Sullivan, began visiting Marybelle regularly. He wasn't there to judge her, he explained, but to offer spiritual comfort if she desired it. Marybelle, who wasn't particularly religious, welcomed the visits mainly because they represented a break from the suffocating monotony of her cell. During their conversations, the Reverend tried to guide her toward genuine repentance and the search for some form of redemption, even though he knew the time for that was limited. The court set the first week of December 1921 as the start date for the trial. The courtroom was prepared to accommodate as many people as possible, but everyone knew it would be insufficient. Hundreds wanted to attend, and only a few dozen seats were available. Judge Harold Morrison, presiding over the case, was known for his seriousness and impartiality. He had made it clear that he would not tolerate emotional displays or disorder during the proceedings. As the day approached, tension in the city grew. Conversations in the streets, in shops, in churches, all revolved around the same theme. What had transformed Marybelle Carter? Was it possible that loneliness and despair were enough to completely corrupt someone's morals? Or was there something darker in her nature, something that had always been there, waiting for the right conditions to emerge? These questions had no easy answers, and perhaps never would. The case had become a mirror in which the community saw its own failings reflected. How many times had they ignored someone in need? How many times had they judged without understanding? How many people lived isolated in the mountains, struggling alone against overwhelming odds, unseen by all? The horror of what Marybelle had done could not be denied, but neither could it be completely separated from the context in which it occurred. The morning of the trial dawned cold and grey over Norton. A dense fog blanketed the streets, and the air carried the penetrating humidity typical of Appalachian winters. People began crowding the courthouse before dawn, vying for the few available seats in the gallery. Those unable to enter remained outside, awaiting news that would surely be delivered by messengers throughout the day. Marybelle was led from her cell to the courtroom under heavy guard. She wore a simple dark dress someone had donated, her hair tied back in its usual tight bun, and her eyes, though tired, held a look of surprising dignity given the circumstances. When she entered the courtroom, a heavy silence fell over the room. Hundreds of eyes fixed on her, some filled with hatred, others with morbid curiosity, and a few with something that perhaps resembled compassion. Judge Morrison opened the session with carefully chosen words. He emphasized that this was a court of law, not a public spectacle, and that he expected absolute decorum from all present. Any disturbance would result in immediate ejection from the courtroom. Prosecutor Theodore Blackwood rose to present the charge, his voice resounding through the room with authority and controlled indignation. Blackwood began by outlining the known facts. He spoke of the discovery in the cabin, the belongings of at least 6 people identified, and the entries found in Marybelle's diary that implicated him. He called witnesses who had participated in the initial investigation, including Sheriff Pritchard, who recounted in detail what had been found in that mountain cellar. His description was careful, avoiding overly disturbing elements, but making clear the magnitude of what had happened. The victims' families were called to testify. Leonard Monroe's sister took the witness stand, her eyes swollen from crying. She spoke of what a kind man her brother was, how he always helped strangers, and how his wife and 2 daughters had waited for his return for endless weeks before giving up hope. Her voice broke constantly as she spoke, and more than one person in the gallery had to discreetly wipe away tears. William Hodges's wife, a frail-looking woman named Martha, testified about the years of uncertainty she had lived through, about how she had continued to believe her husband was still alive somewhere, simply unable to return for some unknown reason. Discovering the truth, she said, had been simultaneously a relief and agony. At least now she knew what had happened, but the knowledge brought with it an almost unbearable pain. She looked directly at Marybelle as she spoke, searching for some reaction, some sign of genuine remorse. The cousin of the missing Tennessee hunter spoke of a man who loved the mountains, who knew every trail and cave in the area, and who would never have gotten lost in the circumstances described. He had been one of the skeptics when his cousin disappeared, refusing to believe it was a simple accident. Now the confirmation of his suspicions brought no satisfaction, only a profound sadness that he had been right. When the defense's turn came, Samuel Garrett stood with a respectful but determined demeanor. He didn't attempt to deny the prosecution's facts. It would have been impossible and dishonest to do so in the face of overwhelming evidence. Instead, he focused on building a complete portrait of Marybelle Carter as a human being, not just as a criminal. He called on people who knew her before the events, who could testify to the hardships she faced. A former neighbor, reluctant but driven by conscience, took the stand to speak. She described how Marybelle had helped her family when her husband fell ill, bringing food and home remedies without expecting anything in return. She spoke of the loneliness visible in Marybelle's eyes, of how the woman seemed to be sinking into a dark pit from which she could not escape. The witness made it clear that this did not justify her later actions, but it did offer context for who Marybelle had been before she crossed that terrible line. Reverend Sullivan testified about the conversations he had with Marybelle in her cell. He spoke of the genuine remorse he had witnessed, of how she would lie awake entire nights, tormented by nightmares where the faces of her victims haunted her. The Reverend was careful with his words, knowing he couldn't appear to be defending the indefensible, but he believed it was important for the court to understand that there was genuine remorse there, not just fear of the consequences. Garrett then did something unexpected. He called Marybelle to testify in her own defense. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The prosecutor immediately objected, arguing that this was highly irregular and could be damaging to the defendant herself. Judge Morrison considered for a long moment before allowing it, as long as Marybelle understood that anything she said could be used against her. Marybelle walked to the witness stand with measured steps. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, her voice low but firm. Garrett began with simple questions about her life, establishing the context that had already been partially presented. Marybelle answered directly, without trying to evoke excessive pity, simply recounting the facts of her difficult existence. When Garrett asked about the specific events, Marybelle took a deep breath before answering. She confirmed that she had been responsible for the disappearances, that there was no denying or escaping that truth. She explained, her voice increasingly thick with emotion, how each incident began differently, but they all followed a similar pattern. Travelers would arrive at her property. She would offer basic hospitality, and at some point during the interaction, the opportunity would present itself. She talked about the first time, about Richard Dawson, and the argument that escalated into physical violence. She admitted that in that moment of panic after the confrontation, she had made decisions that determined everything that would come after. The choice to hide instead of report, the choice to protect herself instead of face the consequences. Each subsequent choice became easier, the moral line blurred, until she no longer recognized the person she had become. Marybelle looked at the victims' families seated in the front row. Tears streamed down her face as she spoke directly to them. She said that no words could undo what she had done, that no apology would be enough for the pain she had caused. She acknowledged that her victims were real people, with real lives, with families who loved and waited for them. She admitted that for a long time she had tried to dehumanize them in her mind to make her actions tolerable, but now she saw clearly the horror of what she had done. When Prosecutor Blackwood got his chance to cross-examine her, he was relentless. He forced Marybelle to confront contradictions in her statements, to admit that on several occasions she had had opportunities to stop but had chosen to continue. He questioned whether her regret was genuine or merely fear of the gallows, whether her tears were for her victims or for herself. Marybelle answered honestly that it was probably both, that she couldn't separate remorse for what she had done from terror over her own fate. The interrogation lasted hours, and when it finally ended, Marybelle looked exhausted, as if each word had drained more life from her. She returned to her seat beside Garrett, her shoulders hunched under the weight of what she had publicly confessed. The room fell silent, everyone processing what they had witnessed. Closing arguments began the next day. Blackwood presented a powerful case for the maximum sentence, arguing that society needed justice, that the victims deserved justice, and that allowing any leniency would be a betrayal of the memory of those who died. He acknowledged the hardships Marybelle had faced, but argued that many people lived in similar or worse conditions without resorting to evil. Garrett, in his final defense, did not ask for acquittal. He knew it would be impossible. Instead, he asked for mercy, for recognition that Marybelle was a human being who had committed terrible acts, but who was also a product of circumstances society had helped create. He argued that the death penalty would not bring the victims back, would not heal the family's pain, and that perhaps there would be more justice in allowing Marybelle to live with the weight of her actions for the rest of her days. The jury retired to deliberate, and the waiting began. The jury's deliberations stretched for 3 full days. During that time, Norton seemed to hold its collective breath. People gathered in the streets, in taverns, in churches, speculating about the verdict. Some argued that there was no doubt, that guilt was proven beyond reasonable doubt. Others debated the appropriate sentence, divided between those who called for the gallows and the few who suggested that life imprisonment would be sufficient punishment. The victims' families remained in Norton throughout the wait. They formed a kind of temporary community, united by shared grief. They talked about their lost loved ones, shared memories, and comforted one another. Martha Hodges spent hours talking with Leonard Monroe's sister, and they discovered that their husbands had been remarkably similar men, kind and trusting, qualities that ironically made them vulnerable. This connection between strangers united by tragedy was one of the few positive things to emerge from all that darkness. Inside the deliberation room, the jury faced decisions that would weigh on their consciences for the rest of their lives. 12 county men, chosen for their supposed impartiality, now had to determine not only the guilt, but also the ultimate fate of a woman many of them knew at least by sight. The arguments were intense. Some jurors argued that the law was clear, and that personal emotions should not interfere with the administration of justice. Others wrestled with deeper questions about moral culpability, free will, and the circumstances that shape human choices. One of the jurors, a farmer named Benjamin Winters, expressed the inner struggle many felt. He had lost his own wife a few years earlier and knew the crushing loneliness of the mountains. He could imagine, albeit imperfectly, how someone might begin to slip into a dark place. But then he thought of the victims, the travelers who merely sought a safe place to rest and found death instead. How do we balance understanding with justice? How do we weigh past suffering against present crimes? While the jury deliberated, Marybelle remained in her cell, far from the tumult surrounding her. She had stopped writing, stopped doing anything but sitting on the narrow bunk and staring at the stone walls. Reverend Sullivan visited daily, offering prayers and words of comfort, though he wasn't sure they reached her. Marybelle seemed to be in a place beyond the reach of human words, an inner space where she confronted alone the ghosts that haunted her. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, a messenger rushed from the courthouse with the news that the jury had reached a verdict. Word spread quickly, and within minutes a crowd had gathered. Marybelle was brought back into the courtroom, escorted by Sheriff Pritchard and 2 deputies. She walked as if in a trance, her movements mechanical, her gaze fixed on some distant point only she could see. Judge Morrison returned to his elevated seat, his expression grave and weary. The jurors filed in, none of them looking in Marybelle's direction, which many interpreted as an ominous sign. The jury foreman, a respected businessman named David Hutchinson, stood when asked. The silence in the room was so complete that the rustling of his clothes seemed loud. Morrison asked if the jury had reached a verdict. Hutchinson confirmed that it had. When asked about the verdict on the murder charges, he replied firmly that it was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. A collective gasp went through the room, though few were genuinely surprised. Marybelle didn't react visibly, remaining seated with the same distant expression. The judge then moved on to the sentencing phase. Prosecutor Blackwood rose to make his final recommendations, reiterating that nothing less than the maximum sentence would be appropriate, given the gravity and repetitive nature of the crimes. He spoke on behalf of the victims who could no longer speak for themselves, on behalf of a society that needed protection from those who chose to place themselves outside the moral and civil laws. Samuel Garrett, fulfilling his duty to the end, made a final plea for clemency. He did not minimize the crimes or attempt to paint Marybelle as innocent. Instead, he asked the judge to consider the full complexity of the situation, to recognize that punishment did not necessarily mean execution, that there were other forms of justice that would allow Marybelle to live with the weight of her actions while still being held accountable to society. Judge Morrison listened to both sides in silence, his hands clasped on the table in front of him. When the time came to pronounce the sentence, he asked Marybelle to stand. She did so slowly, leaning on the table in front of her. Morrison began by speaking about the seriousness of the crimes committed, the devastating impact on the victims' families, and the need for society to uphold its laws. Then, after a pause that seemed to last an eternity, he pronounced the sentence, death by hanging, to be carried out within 60 days. The reaction in the room was mixed. Some nodded in approval, others hung their heads in somber reflection. The victims' families had varied responses. Some felt a sense of justice being served, while others simply felt empty, knowing that no sentence would truly bring their loved ones back. Marybelle received the sentence without any apparent reaction, as if she had known what the outcome would be from the moment of her capture. She was taken back to the cell, where she would now spend her final days. Knowing the deadline changed the nature of her wait. There was no longer uncertainty about the future, only the inevitable countdown to a predetermined end. Reverend Sullivan intensified his visits, dedicated to helping Marybelle come to terms with her fate and, if possible, find some form of spiritual redemption before the end. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. Marybelle began speaking more openly to the Reverend about her life, not just the crimes, but everything that preceded it. She told stories from her youth, memories of happy times before life became unbearable. She spoke of dreams she had had, of the person she had hoped to become when she was young, of how reality had systematically shattered each of those hopes. She also began writing again, but this time they weren't reflections on guilt and regret. They were letters to the families of her victims. In each, she attempted to offer some kind of closure, some details about her loved ones' final moments that might perhaps bring a shred of peace. She didn't attempt to apologize, knowing that words would be inadequate, but offered the unvarnished truth, letting each family decide what to do with this information. Some families refused to receive the letters, wanting nothing from the woman who had destroyed their lives. Others read them and then burned them, unable to find any value in them. But some, like Martha Hodges, kept the letters carefully. Martha told the Reverend that, as painful as it was, knowing exactly what had happened to William was better than spending the rest of her life wondering. Knowledge, however dark, at least put an end to years of torturous uncertainty. As the days passed and the execution date approached, the atmosphere in Norton gradually returned to normal. Journalists set out in search of other stories, the victims' families returned home to try to rebuild their lives, and the town's daily routine resumed its usual rhythm. But something had changed permanently: the collective innocence. The belief that this kind of evil only occurred in faraway places had been shattered. People looked at the surrounding mountains with different eyes now, seeing not only natural beauty, but also the dark secrets that might lurk in their shadows. Marybelle spent her final days in silent contemplation. She accepted her sentence without protest, without appeals, without last-ditch attempts to stave off the inevitable. Reverend Sullivan reported that she seemed to have found a kind of resigned peace, not happiness or absolution, but an acceptance of what was to come. She told him that perhaps death was a mercy, a release not only from the world, but from herself and the person she had become. The final days of January 1922 brought a particularly intense cold to the Virginia mountains. Snow covered the Appalachian foothills, transforming the landscape into a white blanket that muffled all sound. Norton woke each morning to a gray sky that seemed to reflect the dark weight hanging over the town. The execution date approached inexorably, and with it came a mixture of anticipation and unease few admitted to feeling. Public executions were crowd-drawing events of the era, seen by many as a necessary execution of justice, and by others as a macabre form of entertainment. Sheriff Pritchard, however, decided that this particular execution would be conducted differently. He had witnessed executions that had become circuses, with peddlers, gambling, and behavior that he considered disrespectful to both the victims and the seriousness of justice itself. He determined that only a limited number of official witnesses would be present, in addition to the families of the victims who wished to attend. Marybelle spent her final weeks in an almost monastic routine. She would wake before dawn, even in the cold darkness of her windowless cell. She would spend hours in silent prayer, something Reverend Sullivan had encouraged her to do as a way to find some inner peace. She ate sparingly, just enough to stay functional, and devoted most of her time to writing. In addition to letters to her families, she began writing something that resembled a full confession, a detailed record of everything that had happened during those terrible years. The document was not intended for the immediate public, but rather for the county archives, so that future generations could fully understand what had happened. Marybelle wrote about each victim individually, how each encounter unfolded, the specific moments in which she made choices that determined the outcome. She spared no detail, acknowledging the rationalizations she had used, the lies she had told herself, the gradual deterioration of her moral conscience. A particularly disturbing aspect of her written confessions was the honesty with which she described her own psychological transformation. She explained how, after the first incident with Richard Dawson, she had spent weeks waiting to be discovered, jumping at every sound, unable to sleep. But when no one came, when life continued as if nothing had happened, something shifted within her. The guilt didn't disappear, but was gradually replaced by a kind of dissociation. She began to see her actions as separate from herself, as if someone else were doing those things, while her true self simply watched helplessly. This dissociation facilitated each subsequent crime. Marybelle described how she could be cordial to travelers, offering them tea and conversation, while a calculating part of her mind was already planning. She acknowledged that this didn't absolve her of responsibility, that she still made conscious choices at each step, but it offered a window into understanding how a person could live with such extreme contradictions. During the day, she was the solitary but polite hostess. At night, she became something else entirely. Reverend Sullivan spent long hours discussing these writings with Marybelle. He was deeply disturbed by what he read, but also fascinated in a way that made him uncomfortable. Here was a first-hand account of how humanity could fragment, how morality could be eroded by loneliness, despair, and repeated bad choices until the original person all but disappeared. He struggled between his pastoral duty to offer comfort and his own moral revulsion at what she described. During one of their last conversations, Marybelle made an observation that would stay with Sullivan for the rest of his life. She said the most terrifying part of her entire experience wasn't the fear of death or even the guilt of her crimes, but rather the realization of how easy it had been to cross those lines. She wasn't a born monster, he insisted, but an ordinary person who encountered extreme circumstances and made terrible choices. And if that was true for her, then it was potentially true for anyone. Everyone carried within them the capacity for both good and evil, and circumstances determined which side would emerge. This idea deeply disturbed those who heard it, because it forced a confrontation with uncomfortable truths. It was easier to think of Marybelle as fundamentally different, as someone whose actions were incomprehensible to normal people, but her own words suggested that the distance between normality and monstrosity was smaller than anyone cared to admit. This didn't excuse her, but it did complicate the simple narrative of good versus evil that many preferred. The victims' families had varied reactions to these developments. Some, like Martha Hodges, found some value in understanding Marybelle's mindset, feeling it helped explain the unexplainable. Others felt it was just more manipulation, a final attempt to evoke sympathy where none was deserved. Leonard Monroe's sister categorically refused to read anything Marybelle wrote, arguing that nothing she said could change the fact that her brother was dead and her family destroyed. As the execution date approached, Sheriff Pritchard began the necessary preparations. The executioner, a man from a neighboring county who performed the job professionally, arrived 3 days early to inspect the equipment and make the necessary calculations based on Marybelle's height and weight. It was a job he performed with cool, professional efficiency, but even he admitted that executing a woman always made him more uncomfortable than executing men, something he couldn't explain rationally, but felt deeply. Marybelle's last night was spent in near-complete vigil. Reverend Sullivan remained with her for most of it, reading passages from the Bible and offering prayers. Marybelle remained calm, calmer than Sullivan expected. She told him she was ready, that she had carried the weight of her actions long enough, and that perhaps on the other side she would find some form of peace that had eluded her in life. She had no illusions about divine forgiveness, she admitted, but she hoped at least for an end to the constant torment of her conscience. She made one final request of the Reverend. She asked that, after her death, her writings be preserved not as a morbid curiosity, but as a warning. She wanted future generations to understand how extreme isolation could break a person, how the absence of community and compassion could create monsters where before there were only human beings struggling to survive. If her story could even make one person look more kindly upon someone in distress, then perhaps there would be some redemptive meaning in all that horror. Sullivan promised he would do his best to honor this request, though he wasn't sure the writings would be received as she hoped. They were more likely to become sensationalist, feeding the public's morbid curiosity rather than serving as a moral lesson, but he promised anyway, offering her this small comfort in her final hours. When dawn arrived, bringing with it the day of execution, Marybelle sat on her bunk, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes closed in meditation or silent prayer. She had slept only a few hours during the night, but showed no signs of exhaustion. There was a strange serenity in her expression, as if she had already partially disconnected from the physical world, preparing herself for what was to come. Sheriff Pritchard arrived at the cell at sunrise. He offered Marybelle a final meal, as was customary, but she politely declined, saying she had no appetite. She asked only for a glass of water, which she sipped slowly, as the sheriff explained how the next few moments would unfold. She listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally to show her understanding. The courthouse's rear courtyard had been prepared overnight. A simple but functional wooden structure had been erected, meticulously tested, to ensure it would fulfill its purpose flawlessly. The executioner had made his final calculations, adjusting every detail with the precision of someone who understood that mistakes in this work caused unnecessary suffering. The sky remained overcast, a diffuse, heatless light illuminating the scene, as if nature itself recognized the solemnity of the moment. Witnesses began arriving shortly before 8 o'clock in the morning. There were fewer than 20 people in total, as determined by Sheriff Pritchard. Among them were Martha Hodges and Leonard Monroe's sister, both dressed in black, their faces pale and drawn. Prosecutor Blackwood was present, as was Judge Morrison, fulfilling his official duties. A few journalists from regional publications had been allowed in, on the express condition that they maintain decorum in their reporting. Reverend Sullivan was also there, having promised Marybelle he would be present until the end. Marybelle was escorted from the main building by the sheriff and 2 deputies. She walked with a steady step despite the light chains on her ankles. She wore the same dark dress she had worn during the trial, and her hair was down for the first time in memory, falling over her shoulders in dark waves. There was something almost dignified in her posture, a serene acceptance that contrasted sharply with the terror many expected to see. When she reached the foot of the structure, she stopped and looked at the assembled witnesses. Her eyes met Martha Hodges's for a brief moment, and something passed between them, a silent communication that perhaps only the 2 of them fully understood. Then Marybelle turned to Sheriff Pritchard and nodded slightly, indicating she was ready. The sheriff asked if she had any final words she would like to say. Marybelle took a deep breath before speaking, her voice surprisingly strong and clear in the cool morning air. She said she didn't ask for forgiveness, knowing there was no forgiveness for what she had done. She acknowledged that her actions had caused immeasurable pain to innocent people, and that no explanation or justification would change that reality. She expressed hope that her story would serve as a warning about the dangers of extreme isolation and the lack of compassion in society, but she didn't try to use it as an excuse for her choices. Addressing the families present directly, Marybelle said she would carry the faces of her victims with her wherever she went after death, and that this was both right and proper. She thanked Reverend Sullivan for his efforts in offering spiritual comfort, though she wasn't sure she deserved it. Finally, she looked at the distant mountains visible beyond the town buildings and said she had loved these lands once, before they became silent witnesses to her crimes. Then, her voice beginning to crack, she simply said she was ready. The executioner positioned himself professionally, guiding Marybelle into the proper position. Reverend Sullivan approached to offer a final prayer, his words low and rapid, asking for divine mercy for a tormented soul. Marybelle closed her eyes and her lips moved silently, perhaps repeating the prayer. perhaps simply saying goodbye to a world she had never fully understood nor been understood by. The process was carried out efficiently and quickly. There was no unnecessary drama, no prolonging of the agony. The executioner did his job with the cold competence of a professional, and within minutes it was all over. Marybelle Carter, who had lived 33 years in those mountains, who had known love and loss, loneliness and despair, who had crossed terrible lines and destroyed innocent lives, was no more. Her body was turned over to the county for burial in an unmarked area of the local cemetery, without a headstone, without a memorial, destined to be forgotten. The witnesses slowly dispersed, each carrying their own thoughts and feelings about what they had witnessed. Martha Hodges lingered longer than the others, staring at the now empty room, trying to process whether she felt any sense of justice or closure. She concluded, as she finally walked away, that perhaps there was no true closure possible for this kind of loss, only the need to move on, carrying the absence like a wound that would never fully heal. In the days and weeks that followed, Norton gradually returned to its normal routine. Journalists published their final articles and moved on to other stories. The victims' families returned to their lives, forever changed, but determined not to let the tragedy completely define them. The mountain cabin was eventually burned by order of the county, physically eliminating the site where so many horrors occurred. Smoke billowed up the snow-covered slopes, dissipating into the grey sky as if carrying with it the last physical traces of that dark history. Reverend Sullivan kept his promise to preserve Marybelle's writings, depositing them in the county archives, with specific instructions about their educational purpose. Over the years, scholars would occasionally examine them, trying to understand the psychology behind the events, debating questions of moral responsibility and extenuating circumstances. But for most people in Norton and the surrounding area, Marybelle Carter gradually became just a whispered story, a dark legend of the mountains, a name associated with times they would rather forget. The Appalachian Mountains remained, eternal and impassive, their dense forests and deep valleys holding countless secrets beyond. Life continued to flow through those lands as it always had, with new travelers trekking the trails, new families settling on the slopes, new chapters being written in the region's long and complex history. But those who knew Marybelle Carter's story never looked at those mountains quite the same way again. There was a painful lesson buried in that tragedy, one many preferred to ignore, but one that remained relevant. Marybelle's story was not just about a woman who committed terrible crimes, but also about a society that allowed someone to fall through every safety net, that isolated and marginalized until humanity began to unravel. It didn't excuse her actions, but it offered context for how evil could emerge not from innate monsters, but from ordinary people broken by extreme circumstances and poor choices accumulated over time. Travelers who still pass through those mountains today, more than a century later, rarely know the history that unfolded there in 1921. The trails have been modernized, technology has transformed communication and transportation, and the world has changed in ways those people could hardly have imagined, but human nature remains fundamentally the same, with its capacity for kindness and cruelty, for compassion and indifference, for redemption and fall. The story of Marybelle Carter and the lives she destroyed serves as a grim reminder that evil rarely emerges in obvious, dramatic ways. Often it grows slowly in the shadows, fueled by isolation, despair, and the gradual erosion of moral principles. It also serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of community, compassion, and not allowing people to fall to the margins of society where darkness can consume them completely. The mountains of Virginia hold this story, as they hold so many others, silent and impassive, witnesses to generations of human lives with all their complexities, tragedies, and mysteries. And on winter nights, when the mist descends on the valleys and the wind howls through the ancient trees, it is easy to imagine that those mountains still remember, that the echoes of those distant events still resonate in their depths, a whispered memory of when civilization failed and darkness prevailed. If you've made it this far on this journey with us, through one of the most disturbing chapters in Appalachian history, leave your thoughts in the comments. These stories, however dark, teach us about the fragility of the human condition and the importance of never letting isolation and despair consume those around us. Subscribe to the channel for more stories that explore history's forgotten mysteries and tragedies, and hit the bell so you don't miss an episode. Until the next journey through the shadows of the past.